friends.
Hello.
I'm going to do my best to not talk too much today because I am losing my voice, which is a bummer.
Do you want me to run the schedule?
I might ask you to do that just for the sake of everyone being able to understand what's going on.
Yeah, no problem. Looks like we're still waiting for a couple of people to come in. Right. Nonetheless, having a look at today's agenda, it's quite a big one, so I'll get us started. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the December GraphQL Spec Working Group, the last one of the year, in fact. By being here, we have all agreed to the specification membership agreement, the participation guidelines, the contribution guide, and the code of conduct, links to all of which can be found in the agenda. We'll start by doing an introduction of the attendees. And we'll do that in the order that we are in the agenda. So starting with you, Lee.
Unmute. Happy December, everybody. Preemptive happy holidays. And my name is Lee. Excited to see y'all.
Hello everyone. Hello everyone. My name is Martin from Apollo.
I'm Benji from GraphQL.
I'm Matt from Meta.
I'm looking for the agenda for the order, but I'm just gonna say I'm Lens from Apollo.
Oh, I'm Yovi, independent.
Hi, Rob here.
Is it my turn? Sorry, my PR is incoming. Hi, I'm Jeff from Apollo.
Hey, Benoit from Apollo.
And there's a couple of us who haven't made it here yet, so they will be able to introduce themselves later. Okay, it would be great to have some help taking some notes. Quite a lot of the topics today I've added. So especially whilst I'm talking, it'll be really, really helpful, but also the rest of the time as well. So if people can contribute to those docs, they are linked to the live notes in the agenda itself. So please open up the Google Docs and go ahead. They have, I was going to say they've been linked in the chat, but they haven't yet. I'm sure someone will do that though. Okay, first of all, we will review the agenda and then we'll get kicking. Now, today's agenda is pretty big. We're going to look at potentially moving January's meeting, the TSC membership vote, adding extensions to request, making the deprecated reason non-nullable, adding a validation rule that operation types actually exist, changing original to previous in the spec to clarify what happens when you have multiple extensions, GraphQL JS maintenance questions. Implementations may not deprecate a field that the interface hasn't deprecated. Defer and stream updates, which is really exciting. Potentially merging Lee's editorial changes for event streams. Also on the topic of event streams, talking about what to do on errors. Looking at fixing the has value logic in coerce argument values, being explicit about list coercion, and interface field argument default values. So today would, of course, be the first meeting where we've cancelled the secondary follow-up meetings, and it looks like we're very much going to need them. So that is fun. Is there anything else that anyone would like to put on the agenda for today? Good. Okay. I'm gonna just quickly click to see if there are any ready to review action items, but I don't think there are. There is one, but we're about to cover it anyway, so I'll move on to that. Our first topic is I propose that January the 2nd is too soon to come back in the new year. Should we come back on January 9th instead? Thumbs up, nods. Anyone against? Anyone opposed to that? No, fantastic. We'll get that merged. That's
Let's do
that
it.
topic. That's that topic and the agenda item dealt with. Secondly is the TSC membership vote. Lee, I'm going to hand it over to you for this one.
Yeah. So as many of you know, the TSC is a set of volunteers who help make sure that all of our open source efforts around GraphQL are well maintained, that we have the right people in the right places doing things. Anytime there's a conflict, those folks come in to resolve. But otherwise, they're broadly the people who make sure that the machinery is consistently running. Um, it is a thankless job. It is an awesome job, and we welcome anyone's self-nominations if that's something that you would prefer to spend a little bit of your time doing over the course of the next year. This is always everybody who's currently a TSC member will also have to self-nominate to be part of the next elections process. And then we typically run the elections process over the course of about a 6-week window of time. So now is about when we will kick these off to gather everyone's self-nominations. And technically our voting opens now, but what we'll actually do is make sure that we have all of our self-nominations in place before we get this going. Any procedural stuff I missed, Benji?
No, I think that's it, but we do need to get that form opened.
Yes. So what I will do before the end of the meeting is open up a discussion topic in the GraphQL WG repo, and use that as a place for us to coordinate. I'll put a form where people can self-nominate, and then feel free to share that with colleagues and coworkers. And I will also try to make some noise in the repo so that everybody finds it.
Fantastic. And just looking over the TSC members in the working group repo, it looks like the people whose term is coming to an end this year will be Andy, Kuei, Rob, Stephen, and Uri. So those are the people that, if they want to stay on, will need to renominate themselves. And also everyone else is welcome to nominate themselves as well. Okay, moving on. I have moved some of these items around. I don't want to be too greedy with the time. So my ones I'm going to try and keep really tight if I can. The first one is adding extensions to request. We did some work on this previously. The change for this is now very small. We've gone through and named all of the attributes already, so it's literally just talking about adding extensions. Extensions itself is not really meaningful to the spec. The whole point is that it's there as to reserve space for vendors to extend, but it provides us a bit of a challenge when we have lots of different transport specs, GraphQL over HTTP, GraphQL over WebSocket, GraphQL over server-sent events, and various other things where we keep having to define this same extensions property over and over. It would be much easier to just reference it in the central spec. So A, I propose that we move this to RFC2 status, and B, I would also propose acknowledging that there isn't actually any code work required for this. We don't need to add a property to GraphQL.js or anything like that, because it's part of the request, but the request that goes into GraphQL.js isn't really this exact shape anyway. So maybe we do, maybe we don't from a TypeScript point of view, but certainly there's no functionality there. Does anyone have any comments on that?
This seems like a slam dunk change. I might just add a little comment in line on the PR with wordsmithing, just to make it really clear that the purpose of this is to avoid implementers adding additional top-level fields that might conflict in the future. But otherwise, this looks perfect, and I support RFC2.
Awesome. Okay, let's hand over to Martin with make deprecated reason non-null.
Yes, thank you, Benji. Since last month, the difference is I have added, yeah, the goal, maybe I should have started with that, is to make this reason argument of the deprecated directive non-null, because if you put null, it's a bit weird, like, is it deprecated, is it not deprecated? And it looks like GraphQL JS internally already uses that. So I actually did a pull request to GraphQL JS, which was a lot more simple than what I expected. So it's just a few lines. And compared to last month, there is also, I think, one exclamation point that was missing in the spec edits. And yeah, that's about it. If deprecated is staying. Yep, that's all I have. Yeah, the spec edit changed a little bit the wording of deprecation reason in introspection. It removed some of the optionally wording that was there, and now says return the reason why this field is deprecated.
I'm just looking up the requirements for stage 2. Stage 2, consensus that the solution is preferred, resolution of identified concerns and challenges, precisely described with spec edits, and a compliant implementation in GraphQL JS. Just looking at the GraphQL JS pull request. Yovi, do you have any particular feedback on the JS pull request?
Looks right to me. Just to reconfirm for explicitness' sake, the intent here is to say, because this has a default value, that it should have been non-null all along, because the thing that you should not be able to do is replace the default value with the null literal, which would have been allowed in the previous type. And in practice, presumably nobody has actually done that because that would be weird. And instead, we've wrapped this now with non-null, which removes the ability to do that, and now lets clients make much more coherent sense of this type. Is that the right restate?
Cool. So should we move it to stage 2?
I think so. Is there a reason why we shouldn't just call this one completely finished?
I guess the only reason I can think of is it is technically a breaking change. There may be schemas out there where this is breaking for, where they have explicitly set it to null. I think it's unlikely in a well-designed schema, and it's also incredibly easy to fix, and you can fix it on the server side without impacting any existing client logic, because you're making a nullable field non-nullable, which is safe from a client perspective. So I don't see any real reason not to. I'd be happy to merge it as is if the GraphQL JS implementation is up to scratch.
Yeah, from the client, just to be clear, you can't ever send a request with that deprecated, right? So yeah,
Not currently.
thank goodness.
Yeah, and the surface area of breaking change here is for the tooling environment, not for the clients, because that's the place where we would usually be appropriately cautious, is if there's a shipped client in the wild, which is querying from a server, which previously would have successfully completed a query and no longer would successfully complete it. We would
Yeah, but even from
basically never do that kind of change. But I don't think this is one of that kind of change, right? This is
even if it's tooling, all that happens is now tooling types might recompile slightly different. Like, yeah, it's safe for tooling that's already running.
the
The
Yeah, like
only
you
case
upgrade
where
your-
it's not safe would be is if you have @deprecated brackets reason :null, where there's an explicit null there.
Yeah, but even then, existing tooling would not break on that. The only thing that would break is future tooling that now starts depending on this non-nullness. And that seems okay because, okay, you're bringing in this new tool, you now get this validation or whatever, like this error from using this new tool, and you go fix your schema.
Like probably what we'll see is a bunch of graph servers upgrade dependencies and then their build breaks. And then but it's an automated thing. It could be automated if if you're in a situation where you have like 200 graphs, you could just automate the fix.
Yeah, so maybe it should go out in like a Semver major release of GraphQL JS, for example, rather than a minor.
Which is currently the case. It's targeted at v17.
Okay, well, let's put that down as a rule for now. We can always revisit putting it to earlier versions separate, but for now, let's just say it's Semver major, but doesn't break clients. I'm happy to go ahead and merge it. Lee, I'll let you press the button once you've done your editorial pass, and we'll move on if that's okay.
Yep, I'm gonna merge the spec change now. Approved. I'm gonna leave the GraphQL JS one for GraphQL JS maintainers just to make sure that we get the right, it's in the right spot for a major version change. So I'll let you all do that.
Perfect. Okay, next up, let me check that's the right one. Yeah, add a validation rule that the operation type exists. So it turns out we don't check that operation types actually exist. For example, you can issue a mutation operation against a GraphQL schema that only has queries in it. That won't fail validation, but it will obviously fail execution. So we do have the assertion in runtime. So it's not like a security vulnerability or anything. It's just something that we should very much validate. We should be able to spot this at validation time. So this is a proposal to add a new validation rule that just checks that for every operation that you define in the document, that operation type exists. This is actually me representing it on behalf of Benjamin Kraft. I also I did a proof of concept on this as well to prove that this is actually a problem with the reference implementation. So it does suffer from this lack of validation. And I think that we have a GraphQL JS pull request for it as well. Yes, we do. So I think this is actually ready to bump all the way up, but I just propose at this stage that we upgrade its RFC status.
Agreed. This one's an easy win. Thanks for the detailed walkthrough. All right, I'm marking that up to 2. Actually, again, any reason why the validation rule itself should not go all the way to accepted?
I'm happy for it to go to accepted, but I don't know if people have had enough time to review it properly. Though it has been open since 2022, I suppose.
Yeah.
I think I did quite a bit of editorial on this only a couple of months ago. So the final text for it hasn't had much time for review.
Okay. I will do a offline review so we can continue with the schedule. And I might just accept and merge it.
Okay, great. Okay, moving on. Oh, it's me again. Change original. Right. This one's an interesting one. When we talk about extending types, like extending a union, we use the term original in the spec, but we also allow for multiple extensions to happen. Like you can define a union and you can extend it and then you can extend it again. Now, where we say original, it makes the spec text a little bit confusing because you think the original is where you define the union rather than the previous incantation of it. So it would, for example, allow you to do something which I think would be invalid or I believe would be invalid, which I'm copying into the chat, but is right there at the top of the pull request discussion, which is essentially extending a union twice and each time adding the same type to it. We have rules that say you can't reference something that was already defined, but we say in the original. So what I've done is I've gone through the spec text and I've changed the word original to previous, which I think effectively contains the same intended meaning, but without this ambiguity. So essentially, once you extend it, you now have a new version of that union, and then you extend from there. So I think this is just an editorial change. So I was just looking for eyes on it. And if there's general approval, we can merge it or we can leave it for review.
Yeah, you're just trying to disambiguate the double extension case, being clear that you're referencing 1 degree earlier, not all the way to the origin. Cool.
Okay. So I suggest that, go on, Stephen.
Should that be invalid? Like to redundantly add something to a union? Is that something that current implementations would allow or disallow?
We already have a rule in the spec that says you can't do that. So like your extension couldn't include foo because foo was in the original. So it's just clarifying that that same rule applies once you've extended.
Gotcha.
Okay, I propose that we accept this as an editorial, leave it open for 2 weeks or so to give chance for any feedback, and then in 2 weeks' time, go ahead and merge it. Okay, cool. Sounds good. Moving on. Next up is Yovi for GraphQL.js maintenance.
All right. This is a topic to catch a few questions. So start off with a question. Does anyone know who has the Netlify account and how we can access it and remove GraphQL.js from it?
That is a good question.
I've asked around and everyone that I've asked doesn't know. So Lee, if you don't know, and if Van doesn't know, nobody knows.
Yeah, I certainly don't have it.
So last time I talked to someone, they said Van should know, but I reckon you asked them, Benji.
I don't remember if Van got back to me on that. I'd need to look through some messages, which I won't do live.
I just logged in to Netlify and I think I have it. I have access. I'm not sure what to do, so you can ping me. So I see that I'm in an org, GraphQL.org, and there's like a GraphQLJS.org deployment
Awesome.
here. So, yeah, we can.
I'll message you offline. That's awesome. Thank you. The next one up is if there are any expectations of GraphQL.js that goes into docs, versioning, and end-of-lifing old versions. I don't know if we have a set amount of rules around this already.
I don't think we've ever formally discussed or declared any sort of like long-term support or end-of-life scheduling for prior releases. In practice, we pretty much ship a major version and then put all of our attention on linearly increasing, updates from there. And I think there's maybe been like an occasional time when actually, I don't know if have we done a minor release of a prior major version to fix an issue?
Yeah, that latest introspection fix, I think we backported all the way back to possibly 15, possibly 14.
I think 14, yeah.
So Yeah. I, so I'm open to any kind of reasonable proposal on what this might look like since we just haven't really defined one before. Um, and we should probably try to run it based on some practicalities. Like presumably there's some earliest version which is kind of too annoying to manage, and we'd like to end of life it for practical reasons, and then sort of commit to like any major bug or security issue, we'll backpatch to the ones that we support.
The most practical cut would probably be where we switched from Flow to TypeScript. As a very bare minimum. Just yeah.
That's a cool graph. Thanks for the link.
So my proposal would be that we support the latest stable version and the version prior to that, the major version prior to that. So at the moment, that would be 16 and 15. Once 17 is out, it'd be 17 and 16. I think it would still be okay for us to do releases of previous versions if we deemed it necessary, and if someone wants to put in that work. But yeah, we certainly shouldn't guarantee support of anything much older than that, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. I'll try to formally write that up as well. We can have that somewhere.
I would actually add a little bit of concern to that because GraphQL versions can tend to take a very long time, and that could mean supporting something for a very, very long time. My suggestion would be something like TypeScript does. Majors released within the last 2 years are supported. That gives people plenty of time to migrate over. Could also be another time frame. But it gives people security that not like there are like 3 majors and suddenly they drop off after 3 months. Or the other way around, the last major is 5 years ago and we still have to support it.
For clarity, in our case, that would mean that V16 becomes obsolete immediately as V17 gets released because it's 5 years old.
Maybe the last one, I don't know, but like that scenario where like
Some
just
combination of the
change
two
is needed,
policies.
you release like 3 in a short term and it drops something is probably something people want to avoid.
Yeah,
Well, that
we
makes
can
a lot of
probably
sense.
combine the two would be probably a reasonable proposal, where it's like we always support the latest major and the previous major, and then included any other majors which have been released within the last 2 years.
I think that's the best way to do it. Yeah, perfect. Good
Because that
point.
handles both those. Great discussion.
I want to be also explicit about V17 because it has a bit of dependencies with several specs that are ongoing and a working group. Have there been prior occasions where this happened, and should we let ourselves be blocked by it? Like, for example, the first stream comes to mind.
I believe that the first stream is in V17, but it is still behind it's not exposed through like the regular execute function. You have to use something that's explicitly called experimental execute, something like that. So even if we were to like release V17, we're not opening up the first stream it still is experimental even in that release.
Okay, that cuts it for my concerns. So happy to give the time back.
Well, maybe just to clarify that last point. I mean, I interpreted your question, Yovi, as sort of saying, where do we need to be, for example, in terms of our approval process for the first stream to release V17? And I think sort of like implicit with your answer, Rob, is you're saying that we could be anywhere. But is that actually like how you how you feel about it? Like, are we ready to release, let's say we were ready, I don't know, in January after the holidays to release V17 from, besides from the diverse stream perspective, would that be, in terms of where it is now, would that be okay? just to get that sort of on the record.
I'm open to other people's opinions. I was definitely more hesitant, like in the last year or so when we were actively iterating on the response format and stuff like that. Now that hasn't changed for a while, and it's still being behind like the experimental function. Like we are still giving ourselves the opportunity to change things if needed. And I am actively asking for review on the spec right now on like the response format, which would be like the public interface that it's exposing for as far as for the spec. So maybe getting a few more eyes on this, and then I'd be pretty comfortable doing it. But definitely open to other people's opinions.
Yeah, I didn't mean to like sort of question that. I pretty much feel like there hasn't been much change, and it's ready for another like pre-release under that feature flag. I just wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page.
I think one thing to flag there would be a lot of implementations, both on the server, well, on the server side and the client side of Defer in particular, are still out there kind of looking at the Alpha 2, V17 Alpha 2 release as like the protocol that they support under the hood. And so if we were to expose the most recent version of that of incremental transport via single function kind of in V17, just making sure that I think folks in the community are able to consider their implementations non-blocking. So let's say like, defer stream stays in RFC2 for a little while, or I know we were in RFC2 before. Are we back in RFC1 for that? I think there was some question over that, but regardless, let's just say it stays in a pre-accepted stage for a little while longer. But folks have already used some stage, some iteration of the defer stream of the incremental transport protocol, in their current implementations. Are we blocking people from adopting V17 in that manner? Like, for example, if they're still waiting for the final kind of like stage 3 or whatever in order to implement, that would be my only kind of flag of like, is there a way to help folks migrate and stay current in GraphQL JS, even if they want to kind of like freeze their implementation in like, a previous version of the defer stream RFC that's still working for them in production, basically. I'm not sure I'm expressing myself super clearly there, but I hope that the meaning's there. If anybody wants to, if there's anything unclear in there, happy to comment further.
I think I can say it a bit clearer from the perspective as a client maintainer.
Thank you.
Right now we support Alpha 2, and we don't support the newer alphas because we can't just drop Alpha 2. And if we start supporting a second version and then a third version actually gets released, we have to support 3 different versions, which adds a lot of bundle size. The fact that this will stay experimental will mean that we can't support it because it adds a second one, which might mean we have to add the third one. Unflagging the experimental makes it possible for us to just like have a second solution we support, but that's like still manageable. So keeping this under a flag will keep a lot of people back from actually starting to adopt it, I fear. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I guess it's hard to move forward with the current version if other people are afraid to start using it.
The thing is, if it gets unflagged, we don't question it. Then we immediately start supporting it. Perfect, everything fine. But as long as there is still uncertainty that this is not the final format and there might still be another final format after it, I'm sure we're not the only tool with that concern. So that means essentially that we can't support 17, and that 17 goes out as stable, but in kind of a weird state.
There are similar issues, excuse me, for people who are using like the older, I think it was 16.1, who haven't been able to update due to relying on the deference stream as well. So yeah, there are issues around that. I wonder whether the people that are relying on that might be able to contribute some support for the older thing on top of what we already have in main, like maybe as a flag to choose between the behaviors or something. Since both are experimental, that doesn't seem like a terrible idea. At some point, we will need to move over to just the one standard implementation. But yeah, it's challenging because it's been it's like when decorators changed in JavaScript. Like we just went to a new implementation and now everyone's kind of split. Yeah. Is there anything particularly pressing that means that we need to get V17 out? Because I think most things we've been doing quite a good job of backporting into V16 anyway. So I don't see it as particularly pressing.
Yeah, I don't think it's urgent. We can backport work and still make improvements to 16.x.
Okay, so I think we should just encourage everyone to follow Rob's lead and get some reviews and eyes on stream and defer, and let's get this over the finish line because that's going to solve these problems, I think. I want to move on, so please continue that discussion, I guess, on the GraphQL JS working group. Okay, implementations may not deprecate a field that an interface hasn't deprecated. This is a case of if an object type deprecates a field, but an interface that it implements says that this field is offered, this shouldn't be allowed because we want to be able to remove that field later. So it's just requiring that the interface itself should also say that that field is deprecated, or the other way around. Depends which way you want to say it. It means the same thing. This is, I think, an incredibly tiny spec change. It's 2 lines in the spec that just says that you can't deprecate a field if it comes from the implementation unless that same field is deprecated in the implementation. We do already have a GraphQL JS implementation of this as well. So I think this is ready to go to RFC2 status. Does anyone have any feedback?
Where's
It's just
RFC2?
an omission. Like, is this an active issue? If you set up a schema today where you have an interface, you have a type implementing that interface with a field that is deprecated, it validates successfully.
I believe that's the case. Yeah, this is actually an agenda item that we filed from the notes in November 2022, where we went, oh, this is a problem. Someone should do something about that. And I finally got around to it. So,
oh, hell yeah. All right. Perfect. Yeah. Well, thank you for very quickly getting both of those 2 pieces into place. That's awesome.
I think
yeah,
it was
I see the
Matt and
relevant action
Stephen
item.
originally.
Okay. Yep, this one is definitely RFC2.
Perfect.
And considering that the actual implementation's been floating for a while. Do we want to frame it as if the deprecated directive is applied, or just more generically just say if it is deprecated? Because it's
You're the
very
editor.
kind of specific to how the SDL describes it. All right, I'll give you inline feedback on that, and we'll go from
Perfect.
there.
It's a good point. Actually, there's been a lot of discussion around directives being applied and provided and stuff recently, which it would be nice to get some firmer wording around that. So yes, good suggestion. Okay, lovely. Let's move on. Rob, do you want to give us an update on defer and stream?
Yeah. Gonna share my screen 1 second. Yeah, so yeah, as I was saying, we have this full PR for the defer and stream spec. It's pretty large. In an effort to focus our reviews, I want to like kind of go section by section, a little bit by a little bit at a time. The first PR I did is just section 3 and 7. Already got some good feedback, some good discussions from a few people. Would love to get some more eyes on it. And this one is pretty important because it's the response section. Like I was saying before, it's detailing exactly like what the response format looks like. That's important for clients. The execution algorithm, we'll take a look at that later, but that I think is more open to changes without affecting like the final response. But yeah, I want, if you have time, take a look and let's move defer and stream a little bit closer to the finish line. I do one other thing that Benji pointed out was this small portion of the section that I think is editorial, and we'll go a little bit in the ways of making that PR a little bit smaller. We could pull this out and get this merged if that's okay. It's basically just taking the definition of path that we use on errors and moving it to its own little paragraph, because the same paragraph is referenced when we're talking about the defer and stream response format. We're using path in different ways there. So, it just takes the same stuff that was in the errors part and puts it in its own place and references it. So maybe this is something that we can get in the spec ahead of everything else. And yeah, so let me know if there's any thoughts on this. This seemed like it's editorial, so I don't know if we want to go through the RFC stages or not. Yeah, anyone have opinions on that?
It definitely looks editorial to me. I think it needs a little bit of tweaking. But yeah, I think it's good to pull out. Let's workshop it a little.
Yeah, sounds good. And since the question came up earlier, I guess what do we consider the RFC stage of the whole overall defer and stream?
That's a good question.
Yeah, we had gone up to 2 at one point a while ago. Things have changed a lot since then. This is I had closed out the original PR, and this is the new one. We have it tagged at RFC1. And there is an implementation in GraphQL JS behind the experimental function in the 17 alpha. So maybe we can clarify that now.
So I think the first requirement for stage 2 draft is that there's consensus that the solution is preferred. And I think that is what you're currently helping to work us through by going through and reviewing the bits bit by bit to make sure that this is the preferred solution. And I think, honestly, once you've got to the end of this particular pull request that you raised, the chapters 3 and 7, and more importantly, the was it an appendix? I forget, that has the example.
Yeah, there is an appendix with examples in this PR as well.
So I think once those are there, I think we'll be much more confident that this is the preferred solution. But I don't think we're necessarily at that position yet. But that's just my personal opinion. So if anyone else wants to.
That sounds good to me.
Yeah, I'm also generally in support of calling this RFC2 because we're sort of arguing the boundary cases of what it means to be RFC2 here. You've got a full spec definition. At this point in time, we're pretty confident that this is the right path after a lot of iteration. And all of this is getting iterated in the wild in GraphQL.js. So it sure feels to me like what we're doing is working through the details of the final draft as opposed to like working through broad proposal problems. I don't know. I'm comfortable calling this RFC2 just because we're in the like detail phase, but folks feel free to disagree with me if you think that's off.
Yeah, I'm happy to leave it for 1 more month. Just get a little bit more eyes on the response section. And yeah, and I guess what do we think should be the criteria before we move on to looking at the next set of changes? Probably some check marks from a few TSC members, I would guess.
Probably. I mean, mostly it's building confidence in what we have, ensuring our test suite is right, that we've understood the boundary cases that are going to be confusing. I mean, you know better than the rest of us that the reason why this domain is hard is that there's just a lot of boundary cases to consider. And at this point, Rob, you're the expert, and more so than any other TSC member. So you should probably be telling us the areas where you're feeling confident and the areas where you're feeling less confident, and in order to like guide us to make sure that we're giving you the right feedback that you need.
All right. Yeah. I'll continue to do that and we'll check in again next month.
Wrong button. Perfect. Okay, moving on. The next topic is Lee's editorial changes for event streams. I'm just going to give a quick recap on this from where I see it, Lee. So Lee raised this a little while ago, and generally there seems to be effectively this is an editorial change. So it's just saying what we currently do, but in more precise terms, which is really good. The only thing that's a little bit contentious is the wording around internal errors, which we've not really talked about before and in other situations, and what the result is that we should happen there. I think if we were to take out that little bit of text, and then this would be an editorial change, and then we could maybe raise adding that as a separate pull request. I also have a second follow-up one that we'll talk about with regard to yielding errors once this topic is done. But Lee, I'll hand over to you.
Yeah, so my suggestion is to frame this as a editorial change, merge it, and then revisit the very specific details of error management within streams, because I know that it's a broader topic. Because the intent of this change was to accurately describe what GraphQL.js does today, which, for better or worse, is essentially, that's how it's been working for many years, and so we ought to accurately describe it. And we have a little bit of room between our draft spec and pulling, a codified final major release of the spec to come revisit that if we want to. Because I think there's reasonable room for debate, and I know that there was a lot of discussion thread happening within this PR itself. So anyhow, my suggestion is that we merge it since it accurately describes what is actually happening. And then rather than iterating on this, relatively big PR, it touches like a couple of different sections that we then come back with like something that's much more about like formally defining error management, especially if it would result in a GraphQL JS change. I don't want to conflate the two, where one of these is an editorial improvement and then another one is something that actually then changes the behavior of error management.
Yeah, I agree. It does match what we do currently, whether we like it or not. So I agree. I think we should move this for editorial. It's got a number of ticks. It's got a number of ticks already. I don't know what word I was looking for there. So do we want to leave it open another week or two to gather some more feedback and then merge it in a couple of weeks' time, or just merge it now? I'm happy to merge it now.
I will merge it and I will leave a comment in line with just a summary of what I just said. That way we know that like merging it doesn't mean we're closing the conversation on this errors discussion. It just means that we're like opening the ability to have a focused one that will allow for supporting non-editorial changes.
Perfect. I think that's fine. General ambivalence has been expressed. Yeah, let's go ahead. Okay, great. So moving on, related to this is what we actually want errors to do in subscriptions. So at the moment, what we do is we effectively blow up the stream. So if the source stream causes an error, then we make the response stream cause an error. And turns out that's quite problematic because all of the different transport mechanisms that we support have various different concerns on that. Like, should this mean that now we close the WebSocket connection? What about the payload size and various other things like that? And also, it doesn't tie into the way that we generally handle errors in GraphQL, giving us the ability to have like an errors object with extensions and a list and all this kind of stuff. So this is a proposal to change how errors work on subscriptions. And that is, subscriptions already yield I think it's called a response stream, which is a stream of responses, where a response is your normal data and errors. So it's basically to take that final error and put it onto the response stream as the final payload with just errors, no data, and then terminate the response stream in that case. So it is a change in the way that we handle errors, and it would be one that we would then need to change in GraphQL JS as well. But I think from the community that has faced this problem, it seems to be preferred. But of course, anyone who has had this issue and hasn't been bothered by it wouldn't have raised their voice anyway. So we don't really know. But I think it's a positive change. Do we have any general feedback on this?
Well, it's just on the line 307, I guess, in the edited version. If internal error was raised, and there's some discussion on the original PR, but should implementations be allowed to recover from this if they're able to? If at least in my reading, I'm seeing this as you have a source stream and you're iterating through, and then something goes wrong. In a lot of implementations, depending on the details, maybe it's like now you've lost the stream and there's nothing you can do. But there might be cases where you can recover the stream and keep returning events. And so we're kind of saying here that you're not allowed to do that. You have to end the stream.
Yeah, that's a good point of clarification. Maybe rewording this as like an unhandled internal error. Essentially what we're trying to do is define the boundary between what user land code can and should do, which is anything. The intent is always to allow user land code to do anything, and what GraphQL land code should do, and in which case that should be like tightly specified so that user land code can do anything. And in this scenario, like the thing that you would want to not happen is some implementation of GraphQL on some platform trying to do domain specific stream reassembly from like a arbitrary unhandled error. Like you could imagine something being like, oh, I'll just recall the subscription and see and do it for you. Those would be ones that you'd want to do cautiously and with like some framework that developers are very well aware of what they're doing in assembling that in user land code. So yeah, we could probably be a bit clearer about like what is required here. Because the other piece of this, my only hesitation on just like going full force with this change is we probably do want to preserve the ability to differentiate between like a fatal error and a like domain error, right? Where like a domain error is one where you get a this is a corollary of the same problem that people have had many discussions about for regular requests to GraphQL, which is it do you want to maintain the ability to distinguish between returning an HTTP 500 and an HTTP 200 with a payload that has an errors object in it? And this is sort of like a similar relationship where closing the stream with an error scenario is like the equivalent of a 500 error, and sending a final message, which is, and then successfully closing the stream where that final message has an errors object in it, is sort of like the equivalent of us having a 200 OK with an errors object. It's like the server successfully did its job, but the GraphQL layer was not able to give you the GraphQL payload that you wanted. So here's a, we've successfully told you that GraphQL failed to do the thing that you want, as opposed to like the server itself died. So as long as we're giving people the appropriate control over being able to do those two things, then this is probably the right change.
So I think that is one of the key things is differentiating between errors that happen outside of the GraphQL server and errors that happen inside of it. And so, for example, if a proxy goes down that is proxying your WebSocket connection, then the connection should drop, right? Which would be just an error. It would be received by the client as an error, a network error, which is very different from getting something that's been handled on the server and very specifically said, this is a GraphQL sourced error. And that's similar to what we did for GraphQL over HTTP by using the response type in that case. Content type.
Yeah.
Yeah, to me, it feels like a little bit of a risk that this would downgrade errors that were like perceived very critical by the client before to just kind of urgent, and that this might need essentially all consumer code to update to get the behavior they had before.
I think this definitely is a breaking change for clients. If they were handling the errors before, this is something new that, as you say, this changes how the error would be handled. So it is definitely worth discussing deeply. That said, are we aware of people handling errors in this way?
I believe the GraphQL WS library allows you to automatically restart on things like a disconnect. And right now it would also restart if you had a disconnect because of a critical error. But as soon as that critical error isn't that critical error anymore, you won't get that automatic restart anymore, but it would be passed through and then the connection closes. So that would probably be a big behavioral change that at least needs to be called out in a lot of places. But that said, I'm not very deep in that implementation, so I could be kind of wrong here.
I think what one strong benefit is that it aligns basically how execute works with how, I mean, in the implementation nomenclature, it aligns how execute works, I mean queries and mutations, with how subscriptions work, in that, you know, user code is wrapped. So that's you know, that alignment might just help us like in the long term. I don't know how many extra operations we're planning on adding, but alignment is always good. Definitely a breaking change. For the example you mentioned, if it's actually true that a restart happens on a critical error, this is a case where actually we wouldn't want to restart. So we would want to actually, I mean, there's different, I guess, types of critical errors, but I think this could be beneficial. But again, I'm certainly not in the weeds on that.
Yeah, like
Well,
just want to clarify, I'm definitely not against this. I like the change. I just want to caution.
it would be really helpful if you could all go out there and find out if people are handling errors on subscriptions in whatever way, and find out what impact this would have on them, positive and negative. Because really, we need to base this on feedback and feedback from users. So please help with the research. Okay, moving on. Oh, this is a fun one. I've brought this to the working group before and misinterpreted my own changes, my own reporting of the error whilst discussing it. So I'm going to try this again. I believe that coerce argument values has a bug in it, specifically around how has value handles defaults. So this time I'm going to actually read my issue. It leads to potentially undefined value leakage and potentially a null pointer exception if strictly following the spec. GraphQL.js does not actually suffer from this issue. It does not strictly follow the spec in this regard. So it is a spec bug rather than an implementation bug. And I think we've actually found from other implementations, like I think GraphQL.net, that they also do not have this issue. But the spec text, if you follow it carefully, does. So if you've got a schema with a field with an argument, that argument's non-nullable and it has a default value, and you query it, you can query it using a variable that is nullable, which would generally be seen as use the default. So now imagine that we send an empty variables object, so we don't send that variable through. We would then get an empty object, and that means that our coerced values would be, we start off with, you can read the code to the right of the algorithm, but basically I've worked through every step in the algorithm and said at each point what the various things are. And when we get down to the fourth bullet within the fifth bullet, we get an issue where we say that there is a has value because there is a variable that was presented. However, that variable doesn't actually have a runtime value. So we've said it has a value, which means we're not going to apply the default, but it doesn't have a value. And so things go wrong. So I think if I'm mistaken in this, I'd love someone to show me where the little code blocks I've put to the right of the algorithm are incorrect. But I think that this is incorrect, and I've written the algorithm how I think it should be and how I believe GraphQL.js does it, which is just a little bit of refactoring, really.
I think I'm gonna have to more carefully stare at this to make sure I understood all of that. But your intent is to make this more accurately aligned to what GraphQL.js is in fact doing.
it's both that and to make sure that it doesn't have a null pointer exception style bug in it. Yeah.
Right.
Anyway, I've put it on your plates, so by all means, please have a look at this. I think this is actually really important. I don't know if any implementations that have done it based on the spec rather than based on GraphQL JS, which is quite often the way that things happen. But they may have this vulnerability, so I think it's really important that we get it fixed.
Nice.
I'm going to move us on. Let's talk about list coercion. I think this is in the same area of the spec, actually. I've done the same thing for this. I've worked through each of the variables, each of the steps of the algorithm with what I believe the essential state is at each point with a worked example. And this one I also brought to the working group previously, and again, also badly represented. The issue with this is that it's the validation of a variable that is within a list. And that's where the problem originates, I think. So again, this one actually leads into list coercion, and list coercion itself doesn't really talk about variables. So it gets a little bit problematic. So what I've done is I've expanded our example table of validation for variables, for lists, sorry. And I think that this is inspired, if I remember correctly, this is inspired by the input objects table. I will have written it in the spec pull request, but honestly, it's been a while since I read it. So this is all inspired by previous parts of the spec. And the challenging part of this is talking about how it handles variables. So I've explicitly introduced new algorithms to make that wording clearer, which is different from what we do for input objects, which just use bullet points. But I felt that this was actually clearer. Lee, I would very much appreciate your input on this, like editorial wise, to get this accurate.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think this is definitely something that warrants inclusion in the spec or something of this kind.
Yeah, I agree. I'm gonna have to read this one also more carefully because this one is very nuanced. But thanks for coming back and revisiting it and getting it up to date.
Okay, perfect. I'll leave that on your plate as well. Which does mean that we can move on to our, let's just check, yeah, onto our final topic, which is Yakov. You don't get your full 30 minutes, but 20 minutes. How about
Oh
that?
no, I was hoping that the time would run out. Now I have to remind myself what this is. Hold on. So I'm gonna, I guess, share my screen of just the issue, and we'll work through it together. I think Benji, you had a lot to say about it, and as did others. So maybe if they're here, they can remind me also a little bit. But basically, I was working through. I didn't come to. This didn't come to my attention de novo. I was working through some of the older issues on GraphQL JS, and there's basically a question that's asked there by Vladimir Panamaskin, who has a very interesting question there about what happens with defaults on interfaces. Defaults, I should say, on arguments to fields on interfaces. So we're looking at it, just an example of one of them. The question was about in what respect does the type that implements that interface have to match the default, if I'm remembering correctly. And I looked into that just a little bit just to try to answer the question. And it turns out that actually we have a little bit of an issue in that, I think. In that it turns out that default arguments on interfaces are at runtime currently within the implementation and within the specification. I mean, they align. They're meaningless. Meaning those default values on an interface are meaningless, meaning change no behavior, we always use the default from the actual concrete runtime, concrete type at runtime. But we also don't require any we don't require the implementing types to relate to that default value on the interface in any way. So they're not required to implement a default value of their own, and certainly it doesn't have to be the same as the interface. And that could just be a quirk and a little bit odd, but there is an underlying, I think, bug in that when we decide whether a field has to have whether an argument on this interface field. So consider the following operation. So now we're up to like the operation that I have over here, where we're querying the echo field on some interface. We want to know if this is valid. So when we validate it, we want to make sure all the required arguments are included. So in this example, the value is a required argument, but our validation rule has a little bit of I think, a bug in that, and this is in the implementation and the specification. I mean, they both have a bug in this respect, in that they decide whether that is a required argument based on the interface, because it's a field on the interface, rather than checking all of the implementing types and making and figuring out whether it's required for any of them. And so you could get a runtime, you could get a valid query. This could validate correctly, and then it could blow up at runtime, which is, I guess, probably not the intent. So there's a couple different ways of solving this and fixing this, and I think it makes sense to sort of organize it in terms of the discussion sort of along two lines. Maybe, but maybe others might disagree. But like, one thought I have in general is we should probably try to figure out what the original intent is, and work and make sure everything is fixed up to the original intent. And then maybe the question is, where would we want to go from there? Like, what would be the ideal? But it might, and there may not be an example as to like what the original intent was. Like, did we just forget to require the types to, conform to the interface? There might not have been an original intent that we can sort of figure out. And then we should just skip straight to what we would like, how I'd like things to be. And then in terms of any change, I guess we have to keep in mind like what's breaking and what's not breaking. I don't have a particular, there's some extra discussion on this, as anyone might want to scroll down on their own. And I don't really have any particular, strong feelings, about like where to go from this. I think Benji might want to share and post it, like sort of what makes sense to him, but we just bring it sparking from Vladimir's point. We should I guess clarify a little bit more, so just bring it to the table for discussion. And I guess it shows also that maybe seeing as this hasn't really come up as a bug, maybe default arguments on interfaces are not used so much, presumably.
Yeah, I think that's probably likely. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't resolve this. But it's a good point. Yeah, most interfaces tend to be a narrower definition. They're less likely to have arguments in them.
So as Yakov mentioned, I've actually spent a bit of time writing about this. So I'm just going to try and give you my digest of it. Yes, this does seem to be an issue. It's not a major issue because it's caught by GraphQL rather than by user code. So it just becomes a runtime error rather than a validation error. We should fix it. I see that we have effectively 3 potential ways of fixing it. We can just forbid interface fields from having defaults at all. Like, there you go. No default values. It's not a problem anymore. I don't think we should do that. We can make it so that every single one of if your interface field has a default, then every single field that implements it must have the same default. Or we can make it so that if an interface field has a default, then every implementation field must also have a default, but it needn't be the same one. Now, my take on this is actually a little bit subtle. I think we should go for option 3, but with a recommendation of option 2. So essentially, what I think we should do is make it so that the spec enforces option 3, i.e., if the field on the interface has an argument default, then every implementation must also have a default. And then we add to that a recommended spec rule that says that all of those defaults should match. But that way the implementation can turn it off. And by turning it off, this becomes a change that is non-breaking. I have written that 3 is non-breaking from a client perspective. I don't remember whether I wrote that 2 is breaking from a client's perspective. I can't see why I would. Anyway, that's me done talking for now. Please get someone else.
I think I agree with that. Because there will be cases where if we went with 2, there would be a specific kind of type which you would not be able to express, which you can express today, which is my interface defines an argument which is non-nullable but is not required. It has a default. However, each implementation may have a different default. So I want to be able to say it is a non-nullable optional field, which will be provided a default for each type. And then each type can then provide its default. That is a not uncommon kind of type shape to see, or not super uncommon, not exclusively, like, it occurs. And option 2 would remove the ability to do that. Other languages that have this kind of property where you can like override a function or override a method, and also the language has the concept of default arguments. They almost all have some variation of option 3. And then they have like compiler rules that allow you to tighten to option 2. And then based on whether they're like compile time substitution or runtime substitution determines the actual rules of how the default values get put in place. And they all have some call out that like making the default values different in subtypes is a recipe for confusion. So, which I think basically exactly aligns with Benji's suggestion. So, that seems to be the preferred default out in the broader ecosystem. So I support it.
RFC wise, and I'd like to discuss RFCs at some point, but not today. This isn't really an RFC itself. This is more of a reference of a problem. It's not proposing really a solution. Technically, RFC 0 has no entrance criteria, so we can mark it RFC 0. But should we wait to flag it until a solution is proposed, which I think is effectively this solution 3 as just discussed?
I'm gonna flag it RFC 0 since it's like now officially a thing that we've all acknowledged is like a problem domain that is interesting and worth discussion. And broad strokes of a proposal are kind of detailed out in this discussion thread. But I agree, entrance criteria to RFC 1 would be like a basic spec draft with the preferred approach that which we can then start to get into the weeds on. But this is like an awesome thread. I love the discussion that's gone back and forth and like understanding this problem. Yakov, I'm curious what you think about this proposal. Do you agree with this direction?
Oh, yeah. I think that's fine. I don't really I think it preserves a lot of advantages and flexibility. I guess the concern that I had originally before I understood exactly what Benji was suggesting, like the concern with let's see, which one was it? Concern was with option 3, that was that the actual default value on the interface for that the interface provides is kind of meaningless. It's just important that there is one. But once we're recommending, once we're saying the spec has to, it mandates 3 but recommends 2, then it's not meaningless. And so then it kind of all gelled for me. So I think this I'm not sure if I'll have the time to. That's why Benji sort of gave me a little nudge, maybe, or maybe that's what he meant in here. That's not quite an RFC yet. I'm not sure I'll have the time to convert the spec language. But if I do, if no one gets to it first, and I do have the time, I could see that happening at some point. In terms of an implementation or a spec thing. But if anyone else wants to take it up, they can just flag it, I guess, here on this issue, and I'd be happy to for that to happen.
Nice.
And that didn't take the full 30 minutes, so that's great.
Awesome.
Somehow we managed to stare at this list of agenda and worry that we would not get through all of it. And here we are at the end on time.
Excellent work, everyone. Well, as it happens, I do have another agenda topic. I have spent today hacking away at potentially building an auto merge system for our agenda attendance. I'm bored of solving all of these merge conflicts every time we add each other to the agendas. But this uses GitHub Actions to automatically merge pull requests. So it's risky. Anytime you automatically merge pull requests, you could be merging things that have more GitHub Actions in them and that then grant themselves elevated privileges and then go and comment on random issues and close them and whatever. So risky. That said, I did write it today and I'm a bit tired, but I did actually pay quite close attention to what I was doing. What I have done is I've integrated into WG utils, which we use to create our agendas and stuff, a series of checks. So it's in JavaScript rather than Bash, so we don't have to worry about like random characters in pull request titles causing shell execution errors or whatever. A bit of code. And essentially what it does is it looks at the patch of a pull request. It makes sure that the hashes match up with what GitHub Actions sees when a pull request is raised. It waits to see that all of the required checks have passed. Importantly, that includes, or should, I haven't tested it yet because we've not merged it. It should include easy CLA, I hope. That's going to be one of the first things I test once it's merged. And so basically anyone who's already signed the CLA should be able to automatically merge themselves into an agenda. It limits it to only agenda files. It only allows the modification of one single file. It only allows additions to that file, no deletions, not even a single line of white space. So if you mess up the editing and you're not precise enough, it won't get auto-merged. Start careful. We can soften it from there. So yeah, essentially, I'm hopeful that this is a solid thing to do that should save us a bit of effort. And if it works nicely, we can roll it out across all of our sub-working groups so that people can just add themselves and add their agenda topics and not have to wait for them to be merged. So the ask is, if anyone has experience writing pull request target GitHub Actions or knows about own requests, that's own with a P, then no, some people say pwn, but that's not how you say that word. Then please, by all means, I would love you to have a look over the code. Otherwise, I'd like to get this merged before the January working group so we can hopefully get some auto merges tested in January.
I support. Let's do it. This is also a pretty safe repo to be experimental with. The working group, this is our space to stay organized. So I'm in favor of trying stuff out and seeing what works.
That's what I figured. There is a risk of potentially losing a few discussions and issues if something was to go catastrophically wrong. But what's the value in someone doing that? Why would they do that?
We got the magic of Git. There's history and version control. So, worst case, yeah, we fix it.
not for issues and discussions. But yeah.
Oh, I guess so. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Right. We've made it through the agenda. We've got 4 minutes to spare. Everyone go and enjoy your 4 minutes. Goodbye, everyone.
Thanks, y'all.
See you in the new year.
Yeah, thank you.
See you.
Thanks, y'all.
Bye.